Welcome to a new video, and today I'm gonna talk about the Battle of Kursk. The Battle of Kursk, or Operation Citadel, was the largest tank battle ever in history and a decisive battle on the Eastern Front in World War II. This battle also saw the day with the greatest losses in the history of the air war. The battle took place in July and August of 1943 between Germany and the Soviet Union near the city of Kursk in Russia. The battle involved 900,000 men of infantry, 2,700 tanks and 2,000 aircraft on the German side and 1.3 million men of infantry, 3,600 tanks and 2,400 aircraft on the side of the Soviet Union. After the Battle of Stalingrad, heavy losses created a troop shortage on the southern front. Von Manstein therefore had his troops withdrawn to extend the supply lines of the Red Army. The Russians were convinced that the German army was already virtually defeated and that the war was nearing its end. However, the Germans were still able to launch attacks against the Russians. The Germans gathered their own troops near the city of Krasnograd and on February 18, 1943, launched a counter-offensive toward the city of Kharkov on the Russians' right wing, where General Nikolai Fatmin was located. The Russian troops were quickly driven back. Stalin saw that the situation was becoming serious and called in Zhukov. The latter immediately gave the order to send all reservists to Belgorod. On March 18, 1943, the Germans attacked Belgorod, but the Wehrmacht was quickly halted. Because of the thaw that now had set in, both sides had to wait at least 6 weeks. In the thaw, tanks could hardly move forward because of its vehicles sank into the mud created by the thaw, the Rasputitsa. It gave both sides time to bring in weapons, men and supplies. This was especially into the advantage of the Russians, with a tank production of about 2,000 tanks per month. Meanwhile, the Germans had to make do with about 100 tanks per month. In addition, the German forces were having problems bringing in enough spare parts. Von Manstein knew that the Wehrmacht could only go on the defensive. At most he could launch attacks somewhere local. Von Manstein saw an opportunity to recapture the salient bulge in the front line at Kursk. When Operation Citadel began, both sides had already amassed many troops and equipment. Von Manstein wanted to attack immediately, but Hitler ordered him to wait until more Tigers were brought to the front. Germany's plans. Von Manstein wanted to drive the southern wing of the Russians back to the Sea of Azov and surround them there. However, the Oberkommando des Heeres, OKH, had very different plans in mind. The OKH plan was quite simple. Heeresgruppe Mitte, led by General von Kluge, and Heeresgruppe Süd, led by von Manstein, would try to encircle the salient. Thus they would be able to take revenge for Stalingrad and repeat the successes of encirclement battles such as in 1941. Little did the Germans know that anti-Nazi Rudolf Rösler was sending all the plans of the offensive from Switzerland to Moscow. How he got this information is not exactly known. Possibly he had high contacts in the OKH, but it's also been suggested that he passed on the British Ultra information without the origin being recognizable. Alfred Jodl said at the Nuremberg trial that the messages were in Moscow rather than on its own desk. Stalin ordered Zhukov to attack the Germans immediately, but Zhukov decided to wait in a defensive position. The Russians were preparing offensive on their own. They wanted to attack the Germans in the summer, recapturing Oryol and Kharkov. This could lead to a breakthrough at the marches around Pripyat. However, the Soviet commanders had considerable concerns about the German plans and also took in concern that they might have to go on the defensive. The Soviets were apprehensive about the German blitzkrieg tactics. General Zhukov requisited 300,000 civilians to dig anti-tank trenches with shovels. He also ordered 500,000 anti-tank mines to be laid. In the end, General Zhukov decided that the Russians should defend the salient in such a way that the Germans would break their own teeth on it. Then the Russians would immediately launch a counterattack to destroy the remaining German reserves. The Russians knew that the Germans would attack with a large number of tanks. They therefore equipped their positions with an abundance of anti-tank weapons and they laid minefields. The Russians quickly built up their defenses to 6 defensive belts. Mobile troops were initially held in reserve, meanwhile partisan groups consistently hindered the German supplies. According to the original plans, the Germans were to attack in May. However, Hitler insisted that the attack be postponed until his new wonder weapons were ready, the Panther tanks and Ferdinand tank fighters. On July 2, 1943, Hitler reported that the offensive would begin on July the 5th. Most German generals felt that the attack should have taken place much earlier, since aerial reconnaissance had shown what awaited them now. The generals also feared that over the time troops would be needed to fight an invasion of the Mediterranean. The Russians suspected that the attack would take place between July the 3rd and July the 6th. On July the 4th, seeing that the Germans were beginning to remove their barbed wire and mines, General Prokhorovka gave the order to shell the Germans with planes and artillery. The Germans also began firing back. At 5:30 am, General Model launched a mock attack on the northern flank against the Russians. 2 hours later, the main attack was launched. Prokhorovka ordered a large number of armored aircraft to take off and bombard the German tanks from a low altitude. In the process, the Germans immediately suffered significant losses. In addition to the airstrikes, the Germans also suffered significant losses in the minefields that had been laid, especially under the tanks. Moreover, the tanks had little freedom of movement in the minefields and became easy targets for anti-tank artillery. The infantry could no longer take advantage of the cover that advancing tanks normally provided. After fierce fighting, the Germans managed to break through the Russians' first line of defense. The subsequent counterattack launched by the Russians could be repulsed. The next day, the Germans resumed their attack, again suffering significant losses. Nevertheless, the Germans managed to advance to Ponyri. However, the Russians quickly regrouped and recaptured the lost positions. These would change side twice that same day. Model gave the order to take the town of Ponyri, then turn it into a strong defensive position, but his troops failed to do so. On the south side of the salient, the Germans had an easier time because the Russians needed a lot of striking power to repel Model's main attack from the north. General Hove led the German troops in the south. He originally wanted to advance onto Obian, but encountered Russian tanks and infantry. After a series of fierce battles, the defenders were defeated and the Germans were able to advance to Obian. Since Hove carried out his attacks mostly on his own initiative, without orders from the German army command, Rudolf Rösler was hardly ever informed. Normally, therefore, the Russians knew roughly where the Germans were going to attack. However, now, without the vital information from Rudolf Rösler, they were often in the dark. The Germans took advantage of this and were able to defeat misaligned troops without much difficulty. The largest tank battle in history took place on the fields around Prokhorovka. The Russians launched a massive attack with hundreds of tanks on July the 12th. Hove also deployed its tanks in response. Much has been written about this tank battle, and only recently it has come to light what really happened. Many of the articles are laid with misinformation based on the Russian propaganda that has been taken for truth over the years. It was portrayed that the Germans would have lost at least 400 tanks, including more than 200 Tigers, when there were not even that many Tigers deployed in the entire Battle of Kursk, because the production of Tigers was low. The losses were proportionally much lower in reality, while the Russians suffered very heavy losses. According to the latest readings, the German attack forces at that time proposed 186 armored vehicles, of which 117 were tanks. Russian General Pavel Rozmisarov had unexpectedly advantage from the east with 800 T-34 tanks, 400 of which he immediately deployed against the exhausted Germans. Although it's unclear exactly what happened, the vanguard of the Russian tanks reportedly drove into anti-tank ditch, after which the drivers of the rear tanks tried to turn around in panic, making them an easy target for the Germans and even colliding with each other. Russian losses that day were said to be 235 tanks against 3 for the Germans. Higher estimates go as far as 822 tanks on the Russian side. Stalin was incensed at the Red Army's massive loss and demanded an explanation on this. Rostrimov and his political commissar Nikita Khrushchev, who would later become the Soviet leader, are said to have decided to save their careers and perhaps their lives by spreading the myth of the heroic battle, be that it may the Russian losses far exceeded the German ones. Von Manstein wanted to exploit the somewhat regained initiative after this tank battle, but after Hitler's intervention, Operation Citadel was called off due to the landing in Sicily. During Operation Citadel, a new front opened up for the Germans. Hitler knew there would be a landing in the Mediterranean, only it was unknown where and when it would happen. At the worst possible time, the time had come. The British and Americans launched an invasion on Sicily on July the 10th. With the execution of Operation Husky, Stalin's wish was finally fulfilled. A second front had been opened. At last the Germans would have to pull troops away from the Eastern Front. On July the 13th, Hitler summoned Gunther von Kluge and von Manstein to his headquarters, the Wolfschanze, in East Prussia. Hitler was considering taking troops away from the Eastern Front and stationing them in Italy. These would be troops who were currently conducting an Operation Citadel. Von Manstein did not actually want to surrender troops and told Hitler one major effort at Kursk would bring him victory. With rare indulgence, Hitler gave von Manstein a few more days, but then he gave final orders to temporarily halt the offensive. In the end, only the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler would leave for Italy for the time being. The Germans were dealt heavy blows. The Russians launched a counter-offensive to the north of the salient. In addition, the British along with the Americans had landed in Sicily 2 days before, so Hitler had to remove units from the Eastern Front and transfer them to Italy. Hitler had decided, however, that attacks on the southern side of the salient could continue. Meanwhile, Hove had quickly conducted few local encirclements. However, the Russians attacked Model's left flank en masse, and it had to retreat to avoid encirclement. By July the 15th, Hove's advance had almost come to a halt. The Russians felt it was time to launch an offensive in the south as well. The Red Army quickly managed to capture the areas, and by July the 23rd the Russians had already advanced to the area where Operation Citadel had begun. This marked the first gains for the Russians in a summer offensive. Over the months the Russians achieved many more successes, although they were stopped one more time at the Hagen line. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe, and I hope to see you in the next video.